Good morning, everyone. My name is Grant Campbell. I'm a partner here at Brody's. I'll be chairing today's session. This is our first dedicated cyber event. Thank you all for coming. The fact we're doing this, I think, reflects as a reflection of the growing threat that we face from cyber issues in an increasingly interconnected world. And cyber attacks have been increasingly making global headlines. Microsoft, Colonial Pipelines, there's a litany of cyber attacks that have made global headlines. But the evidence shows that organizations of all sizes and all types are at risk. Recently in the UK, IT Governance has published stats for Q1 of this year, which show that there were over 350 cyber incidents, but approximately 3.2 billion records affected. So a huge number of records and a 50% increase in the number of breaches compared to the equivalent quarter of 2020. And the UK government stats issued in March show that 40% of businesses and 25% of charities have had some form of cyber breach or attack in the last 12 months. And I think these stats probably reflect the fact that COVID has not only encouraged cyber attacks, but it's made it more difficult for organizations to implement and administer security measures. And that may mean that actually organizations who have been affected may be less aware that they have actually been compromised. So, and while external attacks have grabbed the headlines, it's clear that internal security breaches can be just as damaging. So I want to introduce our two speakers today. I'm joined today by Martin Sloan, who will be familiar to many of you who attend our long-running GDPR and data protection updates. So Martin specialises in technology and data, and he's going to speak about the threat generally and how to prepare for it. I'm also pleased that we're joined today by Neil McLean. Neil is a solicitor advocate and a partner in Brody's, and he specialises in responding to reputational issues that are caused by cyber threats. So Neil is going to speak to how you respond to a cyber threat. So without much ado, I will hand over to Martin. So Martin, over to you.
Thanks, Grant, and good morning, and thank you for joining us this morning. So as Grant says, I'm going to kick off today by, for those of you that are perhaps less aware with this topic and what a cyber incident or cyber risk is, looking at what we mean by that, talk a little bit about what the risks are to your organization of a cyber event and why we're doing events like this to try and raise awareness and help you think about what you can do to prevent them. And then talk a bit about readiness. So how can you prepare? What are the steps you can take within your organization to put you in the best place possible if and when you do suffer a cyber incident. And then as Grant says, we'll hand over to Neil, who will talk about the process for responding, a bit about reputation management and litigation risk, and then we will move on to a Q&A at the end of the session. Okay, so starting with cyber risk, what do we mean when we're talking about cyber risk? Well, I think the key thing for me is that this is, for pretty much any organization, a key business risk that should be on the agenda at board meetings. So it is something I think that senior board level need to know about, need to be thinking about, because it is now just a fact of life that every organization is now susceptible to cyber risk in lots of different ways. And what do we mean by that? Well, I guess we're talking about harm or loss arising from breaches or attacks on IT systems and the data that organizations hold. And it's not just about personal data. So I mean data in the broadest sense. So it could be financial information, it could be organizational information. It's not just that, well, data protection very much gets the headlines. When we talk about cyber, we're talking about a much broader types of data, but not just data, actually access to and use of systems. So a cyber incident might impact on your email system, might be a CRM system it takes down, your file storage, or it might be other systems. So ERP systems, finance, to do with invoicing and payments. It could be manufacturing. So if you have machinery used in the manufacturing process, or how you do that, if you're in that sector, it could be impacted by it. Could even be things like building access controls. More and more, they're becoming more and more sophisticated, but they are susceptible to cyber risk, and you may just find that you're not able to access your buildings. And who does it affect? Well, it could affect your staff, could affect your customers, could affect your suppliers as well. And there's lots of different types. So yeah, you could be the target, the victim of a targeted attack where someone is particularly targeting your organization. It may just be a vulnerability that exists that you happen to be susceptible to, which is exploited by an opportunist, someone who is sniffing around looking for, for example, organizations that haven't applied a particular patch to their to one of their systems or to their website, whatever, that exploits a known vulnerability. Or it could, as Grant said, and this is the one that's really growing, is be an insider threat. So someone within your organization who has legitimate access to your systems in the course of doing their day-to-day work, who, for whatever reason, turns against the organization and uses that to either take down systems or to take data or do something to harm the organization. One of the most common ways this will happen is through phishing attacks. So we'll all be familiar with emails we get almost daily now, trying to get information from people or to get them to hand over their password or login details. And these are becoming more and more sophisticated. It's not just the Nigerian prince type attack. There are many more which now imitate other organizations. Quite often what we see is that someone will exploit a vulnerability, they'll sit there monitoring email traffic, and then at the right moment they'll jump in and then they'll do something to try and exploit that. You get zero-day attacks, so that's where someone is exploited something in a system that no one was aware of, which is particularly difficult to defend against. But the other side of that is people exploiting known vulnerabilities. And you will have seen in the headlines, there've been lots of stories around, for example, Microsoft products. There was an issue last year with Microsoft Exchange, where there was a vulnerability there, and a lot of organizations were quite slow to actually apply patches to that. And people then try to exploit that once that issue is known about. So it's about exploiting weak security, it's about exploiting human vulnerabilities, and all of this can happen to your organization, but it can also happen to third-party systems that you use as well. So not just stuff that's maybe under your direct control, but also the third-party systems that your organization is using. And what are the risks that come from this? Well, if first and foremost, you've got reputational risk and damage, and Niels can talk a bit more about this later on. Clearly, if your organization is hit by a cyber incident, then there's opportunity for reputational damage, whether that's because it's impacted on your customers, or your customers no longer want to deal with you because their data has been affected, or even just you're unable to trade. So that can manifest itself in a number of different ways. Operational risks. So it could be interruption to your day-to-day operations. I say it could be people doing their jobs. It could be manufacturing. It could be delivering whatever it is your organization does. The services you provide, they could be interrupted and go offline for days or weeks or even months in some cases. It could be loss of systems. There could be loss of data. Now you can recover some of that, and some of it could be done quickly if you have backups. Other things may be lost for a longer period of time. And there's been a number of stories recently where organizations have suffered a cyber attack a number of months ago and are still unable to get that data back because they've been unable to recover it from a backup. If that is a ransomware attack or something where the data has been encrypted and you can't get it back, and you've got no backup, then you really are going to be struggling. There's financial risk as well. So there are obviously the cleanup costs. There's management time that's spent on that. There's the investigation of what's actually happened. There's doing workarounds, dealing with customer complaints, putting in place new systems or reconstructing data, dealing with claims for individuals. I think it's, if we think back to one of the stories from years ago, I think, which involved TalkTalk, I think the figure put on that breach was a figure of around sort of 60 million pounds that arose from that cyber incident. Now the fine from the Information Commissioner was, £500,000 or a figure like that, but actually the actual cost to the organisation was in the tens of millions, and that's what comes from the reputational damage, the financial costs of dealing with that. And then on the regulatory side, so the Information Commissioner obviously is relevant if the incident affects personal data. But also remember that depending on what sector you're in, you may also be subject to the NIS regulations. And these are specific cybersecurity rules that apply to providers of essential infrastructure or certain online services. And there are duties on organizations that are subject to those around cyber risk and again, non-compliance with that can lead to action from the regulator. Okay, so how do you prepare? What can you do to be ready? Well, the first thing I think is understanding what systems you actually have. So if you don't know what systems you have, then you can't know what steps you need to take to actually protect them. So doing your diligence, understanding what all your systems are, who operates them, are they controlled in-house, are they controlled by a third party, what data is in them, where is that data held, how is it backed up. Doing a detailed audit of all of that is the essential first step to actually help you plan and prepare. I say quite often these are third-party systems, so you'll be wanting to carry out diligence and look at your third-party suppliers. So that would be speaking to them, finding about how they keep their system secure, keep your data secure, and then looking at your business continuity and disaster recovery planning. So a key part of this is thinking, well, where am I vulnerable? How do I back up that data? How do I back up that system? What redundancy do I have? If that system fails, how can I continue operating? What can I do to deal with that? And it's really important with this, you look at not just your internal business continuity and disaster recovery plan, but also your suppliers as well, ensure that all of that actually works together, because there's no point just looking at one part of it in isolation. So key part of this is doing your diligence, knowing what's there, and then thinking about what you can actually do to deal with that. So looking at the internal policies and procedures you have in place, the security standards that you have, that you ensuring those are properly enforced within the organization. Then you also want to think about your incident response team. So one of the really important things, and Neil will talk about this when we go on to the response side of things, is actually having your team ready. So when the incident hits, you know who it is that needs to be assembled within your internal team, you know who needs to be there. Otherwise, you'll spend a lot of time trying to work out, okay, who should we bring into the room on this? So that will be an internal team. So you will have obviously people from IT, you'll have people from senior management, you will have people from marketing, comms, you will have your data protection officer, you will have your internal legal team or your external legal advisors on call for that. A broad range of experts you want to bring into that. And you'll also want to think about external advisors. So again, you will be thinking about things like forensic experts to help with this, perhaps your insurers, external PR consultants, all of that. So if you can identify your team in advance and know who everyone is and know how to get together, then that saves vital minutes at the outset of a cyber incident. And you'll then want to develop an incident response plan. So a plan that you can put into place when an incident happens, saying, this is what we'll do. These are the steps that we go through. These are the important things to do. And Neil will talk a bit more about that when we look at the response side of things. Staff training is really important. So your awareness training, so people know about cyber risk. They know how to avoid some of the things that might lead to a cyber risk incident, but also knowing what to do, how to spot something and who to speak if they become aware of something which they think is a potential issue, because speed of response here is absolutely critical. Understanding your insurance coverage is really important. I'll talk a bit more of that on the next slide. And testing and simulations. So this is absolutely key, that you need to, with your team, go through test exercises and don't do the same exercise again and again, but actually do different tests. So do one for a ransomware attack, one for an insider threat, lots of different scenarios, so that your team has been through that exercise. They know what to do, they've practiced it, they can learn from the things that they do wrong. There's lots of really good resources out there. So the National Cybersecurity Centre, and I'll name check them quite a lot today, have a number of exercises in a box that you can get from their website, and they're really, really good tools to help internal teams learn how to deal with an incident and go through that process. So certainly recommend that if you've not already done that. And then finally, you want to regularly review your systems, plans and procedures. So these are not things you do once and put on the shelf. You want to keep coming back to them and check that they are fit for purpose. You're learning from your testing you carried out, you're updating processes, you're making sure that when you change suppliers, you think about how that fits into your plans as well. Okay, so I mentioned insurance cover here, and why are we talking about this? Well, firstly, check whether you actually have cover for cyber event. So general insurance policies may or may not actually include cyber cover. Quite often it's a bolt-on. So it's really important to go away, look at your insurance policy, see what you have and what cover you have, because I've spoken to a number of people who've had incidents, they've gone to check the insurance cover and discovered that actually they don't have any cyber risk cover, so the insurance isn't going to step in and help them or cover costs on that. So go away and have a look at that and check what your position is. But it's also really important to engage early with your insurer. So when you suffer an incident, engaging with them as soon as possible so they know about that. There will be obligations to notify in your policy, and you don't want to do anything that might jeopardize your cover. So be aware of what your insurer requires you to do when there's a cyber risk incident. If you don't do that, then you're always then going to be on the back foot with the insurer around how you're actually handling that incident. There's some interesting trends around ransomware. So we're definitely seeing a lot more in the way of ransomware attacks, especially for SMEs. And just in terms of trends on this, it may be that insurers are going to react to that, and they may look to no longer cover ransomware payments. It might be that they will start getting a lot more diligence or ask a lot more questions before they provide insurance. And I think we can expect to see clearer and broader exclusions and policies. So again, it's important that when your policy comes up for renewal, you're looking to see what wording has changed and what restrictions might have come into that. I think that there will also be an expectation around minimum security standards. So I mentioned known vulnerabilities. Well, if you've not applied a patch for a known vulnerability within a reasonably short period of time, you may well find your insurer says, well, we're not covering that because had you applied that patch, then this incident would never have happened. So it's really important you understand what your obligations are. In terms of other exclusions, again, I think insurers will look to tighten up where they'll pay out. So we might see, for example, that where employees have been negligent or contributed to the incident, they've fallen victim to a social engineering attack, it might be that starts to be limited. Wrongful acts to senior management, claims history as well. People who have a history of claims, again, that might be something where insurers look to limit their exposure. And also, I mentioned the importance of internal policies and training. And I think they, again, if organizations are not following through in that, then again, that might be something that insurers look to use as a reason not to pay out. Okay, so just moving on to a little bit about supply chain, because this is often under, I guess, under considered. When we're talking about cyber risk, we're not just talking about your internal systems. So many organizations will use third-party IT systems. So you might have a cloud service you use, your website might be hosted by a third party, you might be using a third-party data store. So yeah, whether it's, I don't know, Microsoft Azure or AWS or whatever, a lot of the IT infrastructure that we use and systems that we use are actually run by third parties and are no longer done by your in-house team. But you might also have complex supply chains in terms of what you make or deliver as an organization. So there may be people who supply components to you, if you're in manufacturing, and an incident that impacts on them, if they can't deliver some component or whatever to you to then use to make a bigger thing, then that might impact on your ability to actually service your customers. So when we're looking at cyber risk, it's really important to look beyond just your organization, but actually thinking, well, what are the risks of my supply chain? How are they dealing with that? What happens if they suffer a cyber incident? Is that going to impact my ability to trade, even though there's been no direct impact on me? And remember also that people who are looking to attack an organizations won't necessarily go for that organization itself. They will look at the weakest bit in the chain. So the so-called watering hole attacks, where you go after an easier part of the chain by going into that you go in with malware to one organization, and that's then spread to the other organization that you're actually trying to attack, because that's the weak link to get in there. There's lots of fascinating stories about how people, particularly in nation state type attacks, have gone through not the entity they're targeting, but actually a third party where there's a route into that is identified as being vulnerable. I say if you don't deal with that, then that can impact on your ability to trade. So How do you assess all this, or how do you manage this risk? Well, it's a bit like what we talked about before with the general approach: assess and understand the risk. So what systems are being used, who is actually running them, who's responsible, what data is involved, where are the sources of risk, and then with your supply chain, you want to try and establish some form of control. So you might set security standards that they have to adhere to. You might set requirements around reporting, communication, all that kind of stuff. And then you want to keep checking that actually those are being adhered to. So having the ability to carry out audits, requiring certification, carrying out regular penetration testing and other testing exercises, and reporting that and learning from that. And then that loops back into continuous improvement. So think about your plan for how you deal with that supply chain. Again, the National Cybersecurity Centre has some excellent guidance on how you might actually approach this. And finally, on the supply chain side, again, emphasize the point around business continuity and disaster recovery. Think about what happens if a key part of your supply chain goes down. How can you bring someone else in? Is there a way to work around that and ensure that your plans aren't all siloed? So you're not just looking at what you're doing, but actually when you do a business continuity or disaster recovery test, you're testing your whole supply chain and making sure that everything works together to give you the best possible chance of surviving the incident. And with that, I will hand over to Neil to talk about response.
Thank you very much, Martin. So I'm going to speak a bit about how to respond to an incident. I'm looking at what your organisation should do in the immediate aftermath, and I'm also going to focus on reputational risk and litigation risk. So your organisation has all of the measures that Martin suggested you have in place to prevent a cyber attack, but one happens. So what should you do next? Well, the first thing I want to say is that it's likely to be a very pressure situation. And the easiest way, of course, to alleviate pressure is to get control of the situation. And that's much easier to do if you've got a step-by-step plan in place of what you're going to do, and importantly, who is going to do it. You'll want an incident response plan that says what you will do immediately, what you will do on day one, what you'll do on day two, and what you'll do beyond that. And of course, the first step in all of this is containment. So can you immediately stop the breach or put measures in place that will mitigate its impact? And key to being able to do that is going to be your incident response team. You'll need to mobilize that team immediately, and that may mean contacting external advisors, because as Martin said, you'll want to have a group of individuals and professionals who are able to help you respond to this incident. And it might be that in your incident response plan, you only need to make one call to your external advisors, because they also hold a copy of your incident response plan, and then they can gather that external team on your behalf. I'm afraid the rest of the day is going to be about assessing and managing a whole bunch of risk. You'll have to risk assess your IT systems and put in place an immediate recovery plan. You'll also have to liaise with your customers, insurers, and other third parties. It's likely if it's a serious breach that you'll want to contact the police. There might need to be an investigation as to whether there's been an external threat or whether in fact there has been any internal wrongdoing. And on that first day, you're also thinking about what's the reputational impact of this breach. And I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. Once you've managed those immediate risks on day one, you'll be thinking about regulatory notifications, including to the ICO. Although depending on the series of the breach, you may already have done that. And you'll be thinking about other regulators and stakeholders that you might need to notify. So for example, if you're a financial services business, do you need to notify the FCA? If you're a charity, do you need to notify any government funders, etc. But once all of that has been dealt with, eventually your organization is going to want to think about some long-term actions. And we want to reassure you that it's very rare that a situation looks as bad on day 30 as it does on day one. But it's obviously clear something has gone wrong. So it's important as an organization to review and learn from that incident to prevent it happening again. And that will often mean taking remedial action to address weaknesses in systems or policies and procedures. And that might even include looking at your incident response plan, because as you put that into practice on the day, maybe something didn't go quite right. So you'll want to refine that for the next time around. I'm going to move on to talk about reputational risk. It's clear that a cyber incident carries significant reputational risk. And you don't need me to tell you that reputation has never been more important for organizations and businesses. Social media means that information about a cyber breach can be spread really quickly, potentially damaging an organization before it has a chance to respond. As Martin said a moment ago, really every second counts in a cyber incident. So you'll want to get on top of the reputational challenges straight away. And as part of your incident response team, you will include internal and potentially external communication teams. And PR support can be really helpful at that early stage, just to ensure you get your messaging correct. Of course, what you will say will depend on the nature of the incident, but it's really important to take control of those external communications quickly. You're going to have to engage with customers, and you'll likely need to tell them about the cyber incident, particularly if any of their personal data has been compromised. Or they may contact you because they've heard about it on social media or early news reports. And really careful consideration needs to be given as to how you will manage that contact. Are you going to have a single point of contact, for example, a dedicated email address, or are you going to set up a helpline function? But whatever you do, it's vitally important that the message on the breach is consistent. That's important from a customer care perspective. It's important that all customers have the same information about what's happened, but it's also really important from a legal perspective because of the risk of litigation and claims that may follow any breach. But so you can guarantee that if there are claims, what people will go back to is, what did the organization say at the time the incident occurred, and what are they saying now? And are there any inconsistencies between those two things? And if there are, can those inconsistencies not be explained by new information coming to light? So I'm going to talk finally about litigation risk. I'm afraid it's almost inevitable that if a serious data breach occurs, that claims for compensation will follow. And I want to talk about some examples. The first is Lloyd against Google, which is a class action brought against Google on behalf of about 4.4 million iPhone users who alleged that Google acted in breach of its duties as a data controller under the then Data Protection Act 1998, because they used a workaround on Apple's Safari browser, and that permitted Google to bypass Safari's blocking of third-party cookies to collect and use browser-generated information. So this was brought as a representative action. Representative action is just a type of class action which allows for a claim to be brought by a claimant as a representative on behalf of all of those people who have the same interest in the claim. And this is a Court of Appeal decision. There are three interesting parts to it. The first is that the Court of Appeal found that damages are in principle capable of being awarded for loss of control of data under the DPA, even if there is no pecuniary, so no financial loss and no actual distress. Whilst it was unusual to use the representative action procedure to bring an opt-out style class action, and whilst that was an unusual thing to do, it was actually permissible because all of the members of the class had their browser generated information taken without their consent in the same circumstances and in the same period. So they were all victims of the same alleged wrong and all sustained the same loss. So on that basis, it was the High Court should have exercised its discretion to allow the action to proceed. Google have appealed to the Supreme Court. The case was heard at the end of April this year, and a decision from the Supreme Court is expected soon. And it's a significant decision because if the Court of Appeal's decision is upheld, it paves the way for US-style opt-out class actions in the UK. Class actions generally take the form of either opt-in or opt-out. I won't go into all the technical detail about the differences between the two, but generally an opt-out model is less helpful if you're defending the claim because it involves the award of a global sum of damages based on an estimated number of claimants, whereas in an opt-in action, you actually have to identify and name the potential claimants at an early stage. So that's easier for somebody defending a claim to sort of quantify their loss at an early stage. But there are other examples of data breach incidents resulting in potential class actions. Oracle and Salesforce is a £10 billion claim filed by privacy campaigners in the UK and Netherlands about the alleged unlawful obtaining of personal data by Salesforce and Oracle without their users' consent, which was then allegedly auctioned off to other companies without their knowledge. And that UK claim demands £500 per user. So you can see there how what looks like a small claim for any individual can easily be scaled up into something quite significant for a business. And similarly, BA is facing an approximately £2 billion worth of claims for incidents in 2018 and 2019 where customer information was accessed. And both of those claims are pending before the court, awaiting the outcome of the Google case. So if the Court of Appeal's decision is upheld, they will proceed, and it's likely that there'll be other cases like them. And it's much easier to do that now because of the availability of litigation funding options. That's an entirely separate seminar and probably not one that would be particularly interesting other than for litigation lawyers, but essentially allows potential claimants to bring proceedings with very little exposure to risk. And what we're seeing is claimants understanding that these types of claims can be made and actively being approached by claimant firms in order to bring claims. And finally, just to say, on July last year, group proceedings were allowed in Scotland for the first time. So that allows groups of people with similar related claims to raise proceedings in a single action in the Court of Session. And effectively, this allows for opt-in class actions in Scotland. A broadening out to include opt-out procedures may follow in Scotland. It's under consideration, but with litigation funding options also available in Scotland, we're likely to see an increase in class actions both north and south of the border. So I'm just going to hand back to Martin now just to round up with some of the recommendations for the things we've talked about.
Thanks, Neil. Yeah, so just a quick our top 10 recommendations before we go to the Q&A. So the first one, as we said, it's really important to know what data you have and what systems are in scope, not just within your organization, but also the third-party stuff as well. Secondly, all data is important. So this is not just about personal data. I know that gets the headlines, but actually we're looking at all sorts of data and all sorts of systems. Once you've got that, work out what your key vulnerabilities are. And then you can focus your efforts to actually work out how you defend those, and there's lots of good systems and mechanisms you can use to do that. Understand your insurance cover. Check whether you actually have insurance cover for cyber risk. If not, consider adding that on to your policy. Identify your incident management team, so you've got that team ready to go when you have an incident. Be prepared. Practice. Do tests and test again. I can't overemphasize that, I don't think. Training is also key. So, within your wider organization, ensuring that everyone knows what they should be doing, how they recognize a cyber incident, what they should do when they spot that, and who to tell, and also just good information security practice. Ensure your policies are workable. So there's no point having policies and procedures internally. People can't actually follow them, or they don't work, and that's been a particular challenge, I think, in the last 12 months. If we've moved to working externally, organizations have found that things that they said staff couldn't do meant they couldn't actually do stuff when they're working from home. So keep those policies up to date, provide your staff with the tools to ensure they can actually do their job. And finally, just on interaction with regulators, I say understand whether you are in a sector where you may have additional obligations to your regulators, know what they expect of you, what you need to tell them, and the process for doing that. Okay, and just very finally, just a few further links on here. We'll send out the slides after the event, but just like what we can do, how we can help. We have a GDPR data protection self-assessment tool, which a lot of organizations use to benchmark where they stand in terms of data protection compliance. We help you with policy reviews, developing cyber readiness and response checklists and policies, doing board level training on risk. All of that is stuff which we can help with. So if that's of interest, please do just get in touch.
Thank you both. We're now going to move on to the Q&A part of this session. So I have a number of questions that have come through. I'll raise one, and we'll start probably with ransomware. To pay or not to pay, it was recently reported next GCHQ boss has wanted ransomware payments made illegal. And I see in the chat bar, one of our attendees has said that it increasingly an international trend against taking out insurance to cover ransom payments. So aside from insurance, what are the other factors at play in terms of the legal position on paying or not paying a ransom?
Shall I answer that one? I mean, I think the challenge with ransomware payments is that, in principle, it'd be great to outlaw them, and I know why insurers would want to limit their exposure to them. But the reality is there are many organisations who, faced with whether or not they can actually get their data back, will just want to pay to get it over with. So it's a really difficult one, I think, to try and outlaw, because if you do outlaw it, how do you then deal with that situation when someone's faced with being charged to get their data back? On the other hand, when you pay a ransomware payment, how do you know actually where that money's going, whether you're ever see it again? And I say the payments aren't illegal in the UK. There's, I think, plenty of law on that, particularly in relation to piracy on the high seas, where ransom payments have been made for a long time. But there are other factors to think about in terms of anti-terrorism legislation and funding and things like that, where, on the face of it, the payment's not illegal, but you need to understand where that money is going. So it's a really difficult issue, and I think one that requires a bit of a discussion in terms of what the right approach is. Neil, I don't know if you have anything to add on that.
Yep, I mean, all I would add is, as a litigation lawyer, I get anxious about the enforceability of anything you put in place. So as you say, Martin, if you make the payment and you don't get the data back or what you've asked for in return, it's not a situation that lends itself to an enforceable contract that you could then sue under. So there is obviously all sorts of risk associated, and it's likely a decision that would have to be taken in a fairly pressure situation. When we talk about that incident response, these are the sorts of things you'll be thinking about on day one when all sorts of other stuff is happening. So really need to have a quite clear policy position within your organization on it before an incident happens.
Okay, thank you. Just in terms of readiness, question around supply chain and the length of supply chains, etc. And I suppose the question is, what do you say to those who believe that this is a risk that is simply unmanageable? It's just too big. I know, Martin, you talked about the due diligence exercises that we recommend. What do you say to folk who say it's just going to be too complex to actually manage this?
I think I would point them to some headlines of other organisations that have been hit before. In the charities and third sector, there was an organisation called Blackbaud, which provided CRM systems to third party to charities and universities, and they were hit by a major breach last year, and that then impacted on a large number of charities and universities who, as data controller, found that the data they were responsible for had been compromised. I know it is difficult, particularly when dealing with large vendors, to actually try and enforce any policies on them. But I think you still need to understand the risk, and particularly when you're dealing with, we talked a bit about personal data and your liability for that, but also, reputational business continuity. If you're not thinking about this and you're not dealing with this, then the risk is that you're taken offline, you're unable to trade for weeks, potentially months, and that. That is the risk you take if you don't spend time looking at your supply chain.
And I suppose there's a trade-off when you're thinking about is there safety in just going with large suppliers? Well, there may be in some senses, but you've got virtually no ability to influence or control or exercise effective oversight on some of these very, very large suppliers because you've no bargaining position.
I absolutely right, yeah, and I think that there's certainly something to be said with going with large organisations who spend tens of, if not hundreds of millions of pounds on their cybersecurity, because they have to do it, and there's a size that can do that. But at the same time, don't forget the smaller players within your supply chain who perhaps have an internally developed system or something that's been around for a long, long time and no one's updated. And there may be a vulnerability in there that can take it down. And that's where the vulnerability is. So don't just look at the big stuff, but look at the smaller players as well in your supply chain. which of your suppliers, if they went down, would cause a big impact on your business.
Yeah.
And then looking at what they're doing about that.
And Neil, you talked about litigation risk and class actions. What's your betting? Where is all that going? I know we're waiting on Lloyd and Google, but is that going to be an ever-increasing feature of this area?
I think it will, regardless of what happens in Lloyd against Google. I mean, a decision from the Supreme Court which upholds the Court of Appeal's decision makes it easier, because then there is clear authority that those sorts of actions can be brought in the way that they were in Lloyd against Google. But there are other types of litigation procedure available, both in Scotland and in England, which would allow you to bring a similar action, just using a different set of court rules. Potentially not an opt-out action, which is going to be the most damaging if you're facing a class action, but a class action nonetheless. And what we're seeing is the awareness of the availability of these sorts of class actions is really the next sort of trend in big group litigation, in the way that you see big consumer complaints about issues like vehicle emissions and the like. So certainly it's going to be something that will grow, and you can see the attraction for the individual because they may have had their data compromised in some way, be aggrieved about it, but not so aggrieved that they would raise an action on their own. But if they're invited to join an action where their claim is worth £500, then and there's not really any risk to them in doing that, you can see that for an organisation that can become problematic, because you scale that up, into the hundreds of thousands, and then you get claims in the billions, which kind of takes you right back to how important it is to have a plan and your insurance cover and everything like that in place before one of these incidents happens. Because what you absolutely don't want to be doing is fighting litigation in multiple courts. You want to be able to control that and have a really structured approach to dealing with those claims if they come.
And Martin, you talked earlier about planning, and I mean, it seems to me that when we use cyber, we use it as an umbrella term that covers a wide variety of different attacks, all of which can have different effects on the organization. I guess it's important that planning for those should reflect those effects and wargaming the appropriate responses to the appropriate types of attack.
Absolutely, yes. And so it's doing your tests and thinking about what the different types of attack you might suffer. What are the trends, ensuring that you're carrying out different exercises for different types of incidents, so you know how to deal with that. The more you do that, the better the team will be able to respond, because while you can try and rehearse every type of incident, the chances are the one that actually does happen with the one you haven't quite done. But if you've been through a lot of different exercises and you've built up those skills, you'll be in a much better place to adapt and think about, okay, I know how to deal with this. I've dealt with something similar in the past. So focus on insider threats, focus on ransomware attacks, focus on things that are happening to your supply chain, and deal with different types of scenarios, as you say, war game those, and then see how you respond to that. And you'll learn a huge amount from actually going through these exercises in terms of how you could do it better the next time. What didn't you do as quickly as you should have done first time around? Who didn't you have in the room that should have been there at the outset? Where were the mistakes made? And that will put you in a much better position.
One question again, sorry, Martin, back to you. I think the recommendations that you finish with is a question about, what accreditation standards do you think most closely cover those recommendations? So is it ISO? Is it Cyber Essentials? Are we any recommendations on that? Any views on that?
Yeah, so the Cyber Essentials program is a good starting point. So Cyber Essentials Plus, that's a fairly well recognised one. There are ISOs in terms of ISO 27001 and the related standards for information security. So working through those is key. And then I suppose I think depending on sort of entities you're dealing with, then you may be potentially things like SOC 1, SOC 2 reports, which are assurance audits you can get done on controlled environments, so things like data center security and that kind of stuff. So particularly where you're dealing with a vendor where you are not, we talked a bit about large vendors before, where you're not going to be able to knock on the door and say, can I come and do an audit? If they have, quite often they will have SOC 1, SOC 2 reports where they can provide an independent assessment by a third party against that standard, and you can see the report, you can see the the recommendations that were made around that, and that can provide a lot of comfort when you can't actually get into that entity and look at it yourself.
I think we're now at the end of our allotted 45 minutes, and there are other questions, but I think unfortunately we're not going to have time to go through them all. So what I would like to do, though, is say that if anyone has any specific questions that they want us to answer, then we will try and deal with those after the session is closed. Otherwise, what I would like to do firstly is thank our speakers, Martin and Neil. It's been tremendously informative. But most of all, I'd like to thank everybody who has joined us on this session. I hope that you have found it useful. You will see that we have another webinar coming up on the 22nd of June on definition and privilege litigation, and Neil's doing that with our chairman, Christine O'Neill QC. So if you want to register for that, please visit the address on the slide, and we'll look forward to seeing you there. So thank you all very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.